They called him Barnaby, the unwanted stowaway of the North Star icebreaker. A ragged tabby cat with half a tail and a permanent scowl, he was considered bad luck by the superstitious crew. But when a freak polar storm froze the ship's main turbine and trapped 60 souls in a floating graveyard of ice, the bad luck cat was the only one small enough to reach the heart of the machine. This is the story of the cat who kept the fire burning. The outcast of the icebreaker. The North Star was not a ship built for comfort, it was a 500-foot beast of reinforced steel, a jagged tooth of industry designed to bite through the frozen crust of the world. It lived in a realm of perpetual grey, where the sky and the sea blurred into a single, freezing horizon. Inside, the ship was a labyrinth of echoing corridors, smelling of diesel, salt, and the sweat of men who had forgotten what it felt like to walk on solid ground. It was a brutal environment where everything served a mechanical purpose. In the midst of this iron world lived Barnaby. He was a ginger tabby whose appearance was as rugged as the ship itself. His fur was a matted tapestry of orange and white, stained permanently grey by coal dust and engine oil. He was missing the tip of his tail from a heavy door that had slammed during a gale, and his face bore the scars of 1,000 territorial battles with the giant rats of the cargo hold. To the crew, he was an invisible inhabitant, a biological error that had hitched a ride in a crate of supplies. To the sailors, Barnaby was a bad omen. Maritime superstition is a powerful force, and many believed that a cat who appeared out of nowhere brought the storm with him. They would hiss at him as he darted through the mess hall or throw their heavy boots at the shadows when they heard his rhythmic scratching in the walls. He was a thief of salted fish and a haunter of dreams, a creature that belonged to the sea rather than the men who sailed it. Barnaby survived on the periphery of human life. He knew the exact moment the cook turned his back to the stove and the precise vibration of the floorboards that signaled a patrol. He was a master of the ship's internal anatomy, navigating the high-pressure steam pipes and the dark voids behind the bulkheads. While the men slept in their cramped bunks, Barnaby roamed the ship like a silent guardian, his yellow eyes reflecting the dim red glow of the emergency lights. Life on the North Star was a constant war against the cold, and Barnaby was a veteran. He had learned to sleep near the primary exhaust vents, where the air was thick and sweltering, curling into a ball to preserve his heat. He didn't ask for affection, and he certainly didn't expect it. He was a solitary survivor in a world of ice, a ghost who lived in the cracks of a civilization that had no place for him. Yet, despite the hostility, Barnaby felt a strange ownership over the ship. He knew every bolt, every leak, and every groan of the hull. He was as much a part of the North Star as the massive anchors or the heavy radar mast. He was the secret heart of the vessel, a small pulse of warmth in a desert of frozen iron, waiting for the moment when the bad luck cat would be the only thing standing between the crew and the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. The engineer's secret. The engine room was the loudest place on Earth, a cathedral of noise where 12 massive pistons hammered out a rhythm that shook the very bones of the ship. It was a place of extreme heat and lethal pressure, overseen by Chief Engineer Miller. Miller was a man who looked like he had been forged in the same furnace as the engines. His skin was leathered by steam, his fingernails were permanently black with grease, and he spoke more to the machines than he did to his fellow sailors. Miller was the only human who saw Barnaby as something more than a pest. It started when the cat had dragged a dead, oversized rat to Miller's boots during a particularly difficult repair. Instead of a kick, Miller had offered a nod of respect and a small piece of tinned beef. From that day on, an unspoken alliance was formed. In the kingdom of the engine room, Miller was the king, and Barnaby was his silent, four-legged knight. Every evening, amidst the deafening roar of the turbines, Miller performed a ritual. He would pour a small saucer of condensed milk into a heavy iron bowl tucked behind the primary fuel filters. Barnaby would emerge from the shadows, his whiskers twitching, and drink while Miller sat on a nearby crate, wiping his tools with a rag. There were no words, but in the sweltering heat of the hold, there was a profound sense of companionship. Barnaby became Miller's shadow. When the engineer climbed the narrow steel ladders to check the pressure gauges, the cat was right behind him, balancing on the handrails with impossible ease. Barnaby seemed to understand the machinery as well as Miller did. He would alert the engineer to steam leaks by hissing at invisible cracks, his sensitive ears picking up the high-pitched whistle of escaping air long before the sensors could detect it. The other sailors mocked Miller for his pet, calling the cat the grease ghost. They warned the old man that the cat would one day trip a sensor or jam a gear, leading to their doom. Miller ignored them, his hand occasionally drifting to scratch the one good ear Barnaby had left. He knew that in a place as unforgiving as the Arctic, you didn't choose your friends based on their reputation, you chose them based on their grit. As the North Star pushed further into the high latitudes, the bond became a lifeline. The isolation was beginning to wear on Miller's mind, the constant vibration of the ship making it hard to think. But when he felt the weight of the ginger cat jumping onto his shoulders, he felt grounded. They were two outcasts in a world of steel, and as the ice grew thicker outside the hull, they held on to the only warmth they could find. The frozen heart. The disaster struck during the black hour, the time between 3 and 4 in the morning when the human spirit is at its lowest. The North Star was navigating a narrow lane between two massive ice shelves when the wind shifted. A pressure ridge, the wall of ancient, blue ice, was pushed directly into the ship's path. The collision was not a crash, it was a slow, agonizing groan of metal being crushed by a force that had been building for 10,000 years. The impact sent a shockwave through the ship that threw men from their beds and shattered the glass in the bridge. But the real damage was below the waterline. A jagged spur of ice had sliced through the outer skin of the ship, directly into the primary cooling intake. Within seconds, the sub-zero Arctic water rushed into the system, meeting the superheated pipes of the engine. The thermal shock was catastrophic, and the intake valve flash frozen shut, cutting off the engine's ability to cool itself. Inside the engine room, the silence was more terrifying than any explosion. The rhythmic thumping of the piston slowed, sputtered, and then died. The massive turbine, the heart of the ship, came to a grinding halt. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the eerie, pulsing red of the emergency batteries. For the first time in 30 years, the North Star was a dead weight in the water, trapped in the jaws of the ice. The temperature in the ship began to drop with predatory speed. Without the engine's heat, the steel walls turned into ice trays, sucking the warmth from the air. Frost began to bloom on the brass dials and the iron railings like white, crystalline flowers. 60 men huddled in the mess hall, their breath coming in thick plumes of fog, knowing that if the engine didn't restart, the ship would be crushed. Like a soda can as the ice expanded around it. Chief Miller stood at the base of the primary turbine, his flashlight beam cutting through the freezing gloom. He knew exactly what had happened. The bypass valve, the only way to vent the frozen water and restart the cooling cycle, was jammed. It was located deep inside a narrow, 6-inch maintenance sleeve that ran through the center of the turbine housing. It was a space designed for a robotic arm that the ship didn't carry, and it was far too small for any human hand. Barnaby sat on a high catwalk, watching the panic below. He felt the cold reaching into his bones, the heat he had lived for all these years vanishing into the dark. He saw Miller's face, etched with a despair that no tool could fix. The engineer was looking at the small, dark opening of the sleeve, his hands shaking not from the cold, but from the realization that they were all going to die in a tomb of ice the narrow path. Miller's eyes met Barnaby's. It was a moment of desperate, silent communication. The engineer knew it was a suicide mission, the sleeve was a lightless tunnel of sharp metal and freezing residue. If the cat got stuck, there was no way to get him out. If the engine did start while he was inside, the heat would be instantaneous and lethal. But as the ice outside the ship let out a thunderous crack, Miller realized he had no other choice. With trembling fingers, Miller reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, high-tensile steel wrench. He took a length of thin copper wire and fashioned a makeshift harness around Barnaby's shoulders, securing the wrench to the cat's chest. The weight made Barnaby stumble for a second, but he straightened his back, his amber eyes fixed on the man. Miller knelt in the frost, his forehead touching the cat's for a fleeting second. "It's the gold lever, Barnaby," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. "At the very end of the tunnel. You have to hook the wrench and pull. If you don't, we don't wake up." He pointed his flashlight into the dark, narrow sleeve. The tunnel was coated in a thin layer of rime ice, and the air coming out of it was so cold it felt like a physical weight. Barnaby sniffed the opening, his whiskers twitching at the scent of frozen salt. Barnaby didn't hesitate. He was a creature of the cracks, a ghost of the engine, and this was his kingdom. He dove into the hole, the cold metal instantly sucking the heat from his fur. The tunnel was so narrow that his ribs scraped against the sides, and he had to pull himself forward with his front claws, his missing tail dragging behind him. It was a journey into the very gut of the beast. Inside the sleeve, the world was a nightmare of shadows. The flashlight beam from Miller could only reach the first few feet. Beyond that, Barnaby was navigating by touch and instinct. Every few inches, his harness snagged on a bolt or a weld, and he had to twist his body, hissing in pain as the metal tore at his skin. The cold was a living thing here, trying to slow his heart, trying to turn his blood into the same ice that was killing the ship. He could hear the ice outside the ship, a deep, rhythmic thrumming like the heartbeat of a giant. It was the sound of the ocean trying to reclaim the steel. Barnaby pushed on, his lungs burning with the freezing air. He thought of the milk, the warm pipes, and the man who was waiting at the other end. He was no longer a bad luck cat, he was a ginger arrow aimed at the heart of the winter. The final climb. At the end of the tunnel, Barnaby found it, the bypass valve. It was a small brass lever, now encased in a thick, translucent shell of ice. It looked like a golden fly trapped in amber. Barnaby's vision was starting to blur from the cold, his movements becoming sluggish as hypothermia began to set in. He reached out a paw, but his pad slid off the frozen surface. He had one chance to get this right before his muscles locked up forever. He twisted his body onto his back, a move that sent a flare of agony through his scarred shoulder. He positioned the small wrench attached to his chest so that the open end caught the edge of the lever. He dug his back claws into the serrated walls of the sleeve, anchoring himself. Then, with a guttural growl that was more a scream than a meow, he threw his entire weight backward. The ice didn't break at first. Barnaby felt his harness slip, the copper wire cutting into his skin. He lunged again, his heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm. Crack! A small fissure appeared in the ice. He gave one final, violent heave, using the last of his strength. The ice shattered, and the lever swung a full 90 degrees. The sound was like a gunshot echoing through the metal lungs of the ship. The reaction was instantaneous. A surge of high-pressure steam, trapped for hours, roared through the newly opened bypass. The heat hit Barnaby like a physical blow, a wall of white-hot air that singed his fur and clouded his vision. He scrambled backward, his paws slipping on the now-melting ice. The tunnel was no longer a freezer, it was a chimney. He had to get out before the engine fully engaged, or he would be cooked alive. He crawled through the dark, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear the engine beginning to groan, the massive gears starting to rotate with a sound like grinding mountains. The vibration was so intense it felt like it was shaking his teeth loose. He saw a tiny circle of light at the end of the tunnel, a Miller's flashlight. He pushed his broken, tired body forward, ignoring the pain, ignoring the heat, until he felt a pair of hands grab him. Miller pulled the cat out just as a jet of steam erupted from the sleeve behind him. The engineer collapsed onto the floor, clutching the scorched, shivering cat to his chest. Above them, the engine room came alive. The pistons began their thunderous dance, the lights flared back to a brilliant, steady white, and the ship shuddered as the heaters began to pump life back into the frozen corridors. The heart of the North Star was beating again. The hero of the North. When the North Star finally broke through the last of the pressure ridges and limped into the harbor of St. Jude's, it was a ship of ghosts. The hull was battered, the paint was gone, and the crew was exhausted. But as the gangplank lowered, the sailors didn't talk about the ice or the storm. They talked about the cat. Word had spread from the engine room to the bridge. They knew that a tiny ginger tabby had done what all their technology could not. The captain was the first one off the ship, and he wasn't alone. Sitting on his shoulder, draped in a small, custom-made wool blanket, was Barnaby. The cat looked different, his fur was patchy from the heat of the vent, and his ears were perpetually soot-stained. But he sat with a regal, quiet dignity, his yellow eyes scanning the crowds on the dock. The bad luck cat had become the most celebrated soul on the Arctic Sea. The crew held a feast in the mess hall that night, and for once, Barnaby wasn't stealing scraps from the floor. He sat at the head of the table on a velvet cushion taken from the captain's quarters. He was served a plate of the finest smoked salmon the ship had to offer, and not a single sailor hissed or threw a boot. They took turns coming up to him, some of them touching his head with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. Chief Miller sat in the corner, a clean bandage on his hand where the steam had bitten him. He watched Barnaby with a tired, proud smile. He knew the cat didn't care about the salmon or the cushion. Barnaby just wanted to be near the hum of the engine and the warmth of a friend. The engineer realized that the North Star hadn't just survived a storm, it had found its soul. Barnaby lived out the rest of his days on the ship, but he was never astray again. He was the chief guardian of the engine, with a brass nameplate on the door of the hold. He still slept on the warm pipes, and he still caught the occasional rat, but he did so as a legend. Every new recruit was told the story of the night the lights went out and the smallest sailor on the ship kept the fire burning. As the years passed and the North Star was eventually retired, Barnaby went home with Miller to a small cottage by the sea. He would sit on the porch, watching the waves and listening to the distant hum of the harbor. He was a cat who had seen the end of the world and decided it wasn't his time to go. He was the ghost in the engine, the spark in the dark, and a reminder that no matter how cold the world gets, a small heart can keep the whole world warm. Barnaby was an outcast in a world of ice, but when the metal failed, he was the only one with the heart to save it. This story proves that bravery doesn't have a size or a pedigree, it only has a choice. If Barnaby's courage gave you chills, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Paws That Saved Lives for more cinematic stories of the world's greatest animal heroes. In the comments, tell us, what's the one thing your pet does that makes them a hero to you? We read every single one.